Hey everyone, my name is Brian Kennish. I'm a developer advocate on the Google Chrome team. And the name of this session is Google Chrome Extensions How-To. So I wanted to do a quick survey here and figure out how many of you have already built a Google Chrome extension. Well, I see people on my team raising their hands, which is a good sign. And how many of you have built a browser extension of any sort? Oh, wow, awesome. So a fair number of you. Great. So in this talk, I'm going to do a little intro material on what Google Chrome extensions are and what the extension ecosystem looks like. And then I'll spend the bulk of the hour talking about the technical bits of how you actually implement these things. And for those of you that are already experienced extension developers, I picked some new extensions as examples, and I'm going to pick them apart and show you how they work. So there should be some new content in there for you as well. All right, a couple of housekeeping items before I dive in here. We have a wave back channel available for this talk, which you can get to by going to jump. That's j.mp/chrome6. There's a moderator gadget in there where you can queue up questions for me, and I will try to take some of those in addition to live questions at the end of the talk. As a bit of foreshadowing, I'm actually going to be talking a bunch about Google Wave in this talk and how you can mash it up with Chrome. And the second item is that we have a suggested hashtag, which is Chrome6, to use with your favorite microblogging service, such as Google Buzz. Hint, hint. All right, so I've organized this talk somewhat along the lines of a typical programming book. Like I said, I'm going to start with some intro. Then I'm going to do the canonical hello world thing and live code the hello world of extensions. And then I'm going to go through a series of deeper dive technical topics. So I'll start by talking about webbiness, which is just a fun word to say, but also extensions happen to be webby, and I'll talk about how so. Then I will get into the feature set of the extension system. Next, I'll talk about HTML5, which is obviously a big topic of this year's conference, and show you how you can integrate some HTML5 features in your extensions. Then I'll talk about the experimental stuff that we're tinkering with in the extension system. And finally, like I said, we'll do some Q&A, time permitting. So this thing is awesome, but I'm going to go over to the podium to drive now. All right. So what are Google Chrome extensions? So you already know what browser extensions are, of course. They're programs, usually small, that add some features to the core feature set of the browser. And if your browser has a healthy extension ecosystem, it means that there are thousands of these extensions, these optional features that are available to users. So essentially, you can create your own custom browser. So all of us are running Chrome. We all have different sets of extensions installed. Essentially, we all have a different and unique browser. When it came time to designing an extension system for Google Chrome, of course, we wanted to apply some Chrome-like thinking to how extensions should work. So we made it so that Chrome extensions are simple, stable, and secure. In terms of simplicity, as I hope I'll show later, extensions are really easy to create. They're also simple in terms of the UI that they present to users. So Chrome is obviously a very streamlined browser. Even the name Google Chrome is an ironic play on the fact that there isn't much browser Chrome. And we want extensions to work in the same vein. So our goal is to give extensions all the UI that they need to do what they want to do, but no more. In terms of stability, you probably know that web pages in Chrome all run in a separate process, so they can only have a limited impact on the overall browser performance. And we do the same thing with extensions. So each extension will run in its own process, and a poorly performing extension can only have a limited impact on the browser performance as a whole. And in terms of security, we make it so that extensions have to be really clear about declaring their permissions within the browser to users. We've also worked hard to isolate regular web pages from the extension system so that it's very difficult for a malicious web page to gain the extra privileges that an extension has. And then we have a gallery for extensions, which I'll pull up here. So this is our extension gallery. We also tried to do some Chrome-like things with the gallery. We want it to be really fast for developers to get their extensions live and available to users. So almost all extensions are automatically reviewed and approved and literally available to the entire Chrome user base within minutes. We also want to make it easy for users to stay up to date with the extensions that they've installed. And since there's nothing really easier than automatic, we've made it so that extensions that are in the gallery can auto-update, just like Chrome itself auto-updates. So as a developer, you add a new version of your extension into the gallery, and users, once they're online, get it within a couple of hours. So now I want to talk about the health of the Google Chrome extension system and show you some numbers. So the gallery that I just showed, we launched back in December, almost 6 months ago. And we were really blown away by the fact that on launch day, developers who up to that point just had access to the extension system in the Chrome dev channel had already uploaded more than 300 extensions to the gallery. We continue to be blown away by how many great extensions developers have been creating. On average, we're getting more than 750 new extensions uploaded to the gallery every month. If you think about that, that's actually more hours than there are in a month. So on average, every single hour, a non-Google developer is adding a new feature to Chrome. It's pretty amazing. The usage numbers of Chrome extensions have been equally impressive. More than 10 million extension installs are happening every month. And that represents more than 15% of the total Chrome user base. So more than 15% of Chrome users right now have at least one Google Chrome extension installed. All right, so let's talk about some technical stuff now. So I should give you the caveat that I am the world's worst typer, but extensions are so simple that I thought it would be a shame not to do some live coding and show you how easy it is to create an extension from scratch. If you see me make mistakes, though, don't be afraid to call them out. So I've given myself a set of steps here. So step one to creating a Google Chrome extension, we just create a plain old directory. So I'm going to navigate to my desktop here. And I'm going to create a new folder. And since we're doing a hello world, I'm just going to call this hello. There we go. Already a typo. And I'm going to open up this directory. So that's step one. Next, I'm going to create something called a manifest file. So I'm going to go back to this directory and create a new text file. And the manifest file is the one file in the extension system that has to have a particular name, and that name is manifest.json. So I'm then going to pull this file into my text editor. I'm just using an ordinary text editor. I could literally be using anything here. And as you probably have already deduced from the name, this is a JSON formatted file. And the manifest file is a descriptive file that tells the extension system all about your extension. Things like its name, what permissions it has within the extension system, and pointers to its other components. So I'm going to create a JavaScript object here. And then I'm going to give it a series of required and optional properties. So the first will be a name. And I'm going to be real clever here and call this hello.io. Next, I'm going to give it a version string. And I'm just going to give this a value of 1. So this version string is actually a key piece of data. I mentioned earlier that extensions can auto-update. And this is the mechanism by which the extension system does that. So it'll examine the version string of the extension, and it'll know whether or not an update needs to occur. Next, I'm going to give this extension a description. And I'll just say, I like to say hi. And I'll try to spell that right. And then I'm going to give it a series of icons. So this will be used at various points by the extension system. This is going to take a hash. The first one is going to be a 48 by 48 pixel icon. And this is used on the extension management page. We'll look at that in just a second. And the next will be a 128 by 128, which gets used at install time. And then finally, I'm going to give this extension some UI. And the UI I'm going to use is called a browser action. This is also going to take an object. I'm only going to partially fill this in for now, just because I want to get this extension to a runnable state. So I'm going to add a default icon. So a browser action is a little piece of UI that appears in the Google Chrome toolbar. And it can take an icon up to 19 by 19 pixels. So I'm going to give this thing a 19 pixel icon. And I should be good to go for now. So I'm going to save this. All right, one more thing I have to do before I run this is add those icons that I just specified. So you guys probably don't want to see me mess with stuff in Photoshop for the next 30 minutes, so I pre-made these. I'm going to go back to my desktop here. And I'm just going to copy these icons into my folder. All right, at this point, I should have a runnable extension. Let me just clean up a little here. So I'm going to go to a new browser window, and I'm going to go to the extension management page. I'm going to open developer mode here, and I'm going to say load unpacked extension. This extension is unpacked because it's not all packaged for users yet. And I'm going to navigate to the folder I just created and say OK. And boom, there we go. So we've created an extension here. Now, you can see here is the browser action that I just created. Let me zoom in there for you since it's a little small. This is that 19 by 19 pixel icon. Now, you can see if I click on this thing, which is what I'm doing now, nothing actually happens. So I managed to create a hello world program that does everything except say hello world. So let me actually add in that hello world part. So to do that, I'm going to create a pop-up. And this is going to be a piece of UI that appears when the user clicks on that browser action. I'm going to go back to my folder here and create a new file. And I'm going to call this popup.html. Now, before I can actually use this, I have to point to it in my manifest file. So I'm going to add a couple more things into my browser action UI here. The first is going to be a default title. This is going to be a tooltip that will appear when the user mouses over the browser action icon. And I'll just say, click for a special message. And then I'm going to add one more thing, which is that pop-up file that I just created. So I'm going to say popup and point to popup.html. And then I'll save here. So this pop-up file is just an arbitrary HTML file. I'm going to drag it into my editor. For those of you that are big proponents of valid HTML, you might want to look away for the next 2 minutes and plug your ears, because I'm not going to concentrate on that. So I'm just going to create a very simple HTML file here. I'm going to create a paragraph, give it a little style, and say white space no wrap, just so this thing doesn't break. And I'm going to say my hello world thing here, and close out that paragraph. And I should be good to go. So I'm going to save this. Now, all I have to do to see the results of my change is go to my extension management page and reload this extension. Oops. expand this here. So now you can see when I mouse over it, I get that, oops, I get that tooltip that I created. And when I click, voila, we have our hello world. So now we're done with our extension. I could stop there, but since we have this nice gallery, let me go ahead and actually upload this to the gallery. So to do that, I just hit Publish Your Extensions in the gallery. I'm going to log into my Gmail account. And I'm going to click Add a New Item here. So this takes a zip file. So I'm going to just zip up this directory that we created. So we now have a zip. And I'm going to choose a file. I'm going to navigate over to it. Oops. And hit upload. Now, at this point, I could add some nice text that describes the extension, some pretty icons, maybe even a video that shows you how to use it since it's very complex. But I'm not going to do that for now for time considerations. I'll just go ahead and publish this. And say yes. So for those of you that have laptops with you, I have to specify a language here. Let's try that again. As I was saying, for those of you that have laptops, you can actually go into the extension gallery now, which is at chrome.google.com/extensions, and download this awesome extension that we just created. All right, so I originally concluded this slide with a little joke here. But the thing is, we launched a web store yesterday, as you guys probably all know. And soon you'll be able to sell your apps, including extensions, online. And it'll be really easy to actually make money from your apps. Of course, even last week, you could make money from your extensions. But our goal with this web store is to really reduce the friction for developers making money. Doing things like collecting money from different countries and in different currencies is not easy. And we want to take that burden on for developers. So this is a nice thing to have if you're interested in monetizing your extensions. All right, so next I'm going to go through that series of technical topics. And I'll start by talking about, well, if you only take one thing away from this presentation, I think it should be this fact, which is extensions are web pages. This is a little bit of an oversimplification, so I'm going to correct this slightly to say extensions are mostly web pages. And the reason I say that this is the most important thing to take away from this talk is that you already know how to develop web pages. Therefore, you already know mostly how to develop extensions. So in particular, just like web pages, extensions are made out of standard web technology. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so forth. Pretty much anything that you can get Google Chrome to render, images, Flash movies, Java applets, and so on, you can put into your extension. Secondly, as we just saw, the development and debugging process is very similar for extensions and web pages. So when you're developing your extension, you just edit it in any text editor, save your changes, and reload, just like you do with a web page. In the same way, you can use Google Chrome's developer tools to debug. If you haven't used Google Chrome's developer tools at all or haven't used them for a while, they've gotten extremely powerful in the last 6 months. And I highly recommend them. I'll show you some tricks that you can do with them in a little bit. And finally, extensions have access to all the other handy APIs that web pages have access to. So you can use DOM to traverse and manipulate your extensions. You can use XHR to make cross-origin requests, which we'll look at in a second. You can also, since extensions don't have to be cross-browser compatible, you can use more cutting-edge features that are only available in some browsers, obviously Chrome. Things like HTML5, which we'll talk about later. There's amazing amount of HTML5 features packed into Chrome. You can also use WebKit vendor experiments. There's some really nice CS things in particular for doing filters and animations. And finally, the V8 JavaScript engine that Chrome uses has a built-in JSON library, which is very nice if you're doing any kind of XHR work. You can just parse and stringify without having to pull in any extra code. Now, I said extensions are mostly like web pages. Here's the part that's not covered by mostly. There are some extra things that extensions can do than a regular web page cannot. The first thing is that extensions, as we've seen, have some more access to more UI surfaces. The first, which we've already looked at, is that browser action, which is this icon that installs in the Chrome toolbar. And like we saw, it can optionally have a pop-up attached to it. Next, we have a page action, which is an icon of similar size. But unlike a browser action, which appears in the Chrome toolbar and always appears on every single tab that the user has, a page action appears in the Chrome Omnibox. And it can appear selectively. So it can be toggled on and off depending on the page that the user is visiting. And this can also have a pop-up attached to it. Next, we have content scripts, which are similar to GreaseMonkey or user scripts. They let you inject arbitrary CSS and JavaScript into any matching page that you want to. And then we have some more, we have a bunch of UI surfaces that are not available in all versions of Chrome yet. I'll start with the ones that are most available and move to the ones that are lesser available. The first is desktop notifications. So this is available everywhere except in the stable channel of Chrome. It'll be available. Actually, let me clarify a little bit. So desktop notifications you can use in every version of Chrome right now. There's a special hook into the extension system where you don't have to explicitly ask the user for permission every time you want to show an extension that isn't yet available in the stable version of Chrome. But it's available everywhere else, and it will be available in the next stable version. So these are little info bubbles that appear on the bottom of the user or top of the user screen. Next, we have a couple of experimental UI surfaces. The first is info bars, which are the things you see, for example, when you enter a password into Google Chrome, and it asks you if you want to remember, want it to save your password, which you saw earlier when I plugged in my password. So you can actually initiate these and generate these on your own. And we also have an experimental context menu feature that lets you add items to the user's context menu. Next, we have three special components that an extension can have. The first we already saw. It's a manifest file. Next, an extension can have a background page, which is a page that runs for the entire lifetime of the extension, but it's not shown to the user. And it's useful for doing things like coordinating tasks if you have a complex extension or remembering state, that sort of thing. We'll look at some background pages in a little bit. And finally, you can have an options page, which lets you give the user the ability to configure your extension. Next, we have a set of privileged APIs that extensions can hook into. This is a cool diagram of the extension APIs that a non-Google developer created. So there are 4 APIs for doing things in the browser, things like manipulating windows, tabs, and then history and bookmarks as well. And then we also have 4 APIs that are extension specific. So they let you manage your browser actions and page actions. We also have a utility class for sending messages within an extension. And we have an I18N class for localizing your extension into different languages. So I should say that automatically your extension gets this Chrome object. And all of these APIs are modules underneath that Chrome object that you can automatically access. All right, so next I want to take a look at some examples that implement this stuff. And I've put together some use cases of things that you might want to do with extensions. The first I'm calling the Notifier pattern. This is quite a common pattern for an extension. So the scenario is you have some sort of data that you want to manage and display for the user. It could be local data. For example, you might want to keep track of how much time the user is spending on the internet and showing it to them, or showing them what pages they visit most often. But more likely, it's going to be some kind of remote data. A good example of this would be one of the more popular extensions is the Gmail checker, which shows you a count of your unread messages. So once you have this thing, and what we're talking about here is generally smallish data that you could display with a few characters or a number, you're going to want to show some kind of counter to the user. And further, you might want to add some more details. So if the user initiates some click on the counter, you can show them additional details. So the way we can implement something like this is first, to pull down data, we can use CrossOrigin XHR. So the Chrome extension system lets you make cross-origin requests. I should probably explain XHR. For those of you that aren't familiar with this, XHR is XML HTTP request. It's sort of the flux capacitor of AJAX. It's what makes AJAX possible. So if you want to, once you have this data, in order to display it, we can use something called a browser action badge. So this is a little piece of UI that I didn't talk about earlier. You can overlay some characters automatically on top of your browser action badge. These characters are variable with font, so you can fit somewhere between 4 and 6 characters in there. So it's good for things like showing a number especially, or small amount of written text. And finally, we can attach a pop-up to this so that if a user clicks on our browser action badge and wants more information, we can show them more information about the items that we're displaying. So the example extension that I'm going to show here, I'm going to navigate back to the gallery here. And I'm going to show you this Google Wave notifier that we just released yesterday. We worked in tandem with the Wave team on this. They created a new JSON-based API that lets you get a snapshot of a user's inbox, provided that they've authorized you to do so. And I'm going to install this thing. You'll notice that it's telling me what permissions this extension has, first of all. And you'll see that it added this browser action badge here. Right now, it's grayed out and has a question mark. I'll zoom in there so you can see it a little bit better. And I'm taken to an OAuth page here. So I'm going to go through the typical OAuth dance and authenticate here. Once I hit grant access here, if you pay attention to the badge up here, it's going to change colors, animate, and then it'll eventually show the count of my unread Wave messages. So there we go. It's now in color, and I see that I have 7 unread waves. And I can click on this thing to show those waves. I'm seeing 5 of them by default here. I can actually configure it so it shows me all of them. If I go to the options page here, I can say show me up to 20, and then I'll see all of my waves here. And that's basically a pretty common pattern among extensions. So let's take a look at how this thing is implemented. So I'm going to start by pulling up, first we'll talk about the XHR part. I'm going to start by pulling up the manifest file here. And this looks pretty similar to the manifest file that we created, even though this is a much more complex extension. One thing that's new in here is this permissions property. So the first thing that we have in here is the tabs permission. For some of the APIs, those privileged APIs that I talked about, they require some extra permissions, and the tabs API is one of them. So we're using the tabs API in this extension to create new windows. For example, that OAuth page opened up a new window in the user's browser. We need the tabs API to do that. Also, when you click on those waves in the pop-up, it'll open up the Wave client and a new tab, and we need the tabs API to do that as well. In terms of XHR, we have these 2 URLs specified here. And this is telling the extension system that we're allowed to make cross-origin requests to these URLs. So inside our extension code, we would just make, once we had those permissions, we would do XHR work just as we normally would. Now, I'm not going to show it to you in this extension because it's kind of buried in a library, but I'll point you to the library that it uses because it's quite useful if you're doing any OAuth work. We provide this OAuth library that makes doing OAuth quite simple. So there's not a whole lot of knowing of what the bits and pieces of OAuth are to use this. You can just use it pretty seamlessly. So next, let's talk about how we go about, once we have this data pull in, how we go about actually displaying it for the user. So I'm going to open this library file where the displaying is done. And we have a function in here where we set our browser action badge. And the first thing that we do is we set a color on that badge. And we do this by calling the Chrome.BrowserAction API and using a method called setBadgeBackgroundColor. That just takes a color property, which is an array of RGBA values. And then we have another function in here for actually setting the badge text. This is that same API, and we call the setBadgeText method, which takes a text property and then a string. And that's how we set the badge text. Finally, we have this pop-up that we display when the user clicks on the browser action badge. Let's look at how that's implemented. So a common pattern that I often do when I'm creating these pop-ups, especially things that are displaying a lot of data, you can see this is all the HTML for the pop-up, is that I'll just create a template. So here I have a template called digest, which will contain each of those wave digests. And it has two pieces of data within it, a title and then a snippet. You can see that I've given this an ID of template. Then if we go over to my CSS here, all I'm doing is making that template invisible. So when I'm actually ready to use the template, I'm going to gather all my data together. And like I said, this is a frequent pattern that you'll do, is that you're going to loop through your data and populate that template. So here we have our loop for going through the data. And then here's the key piece of code that takes that template. You can see that it clones it right here. And then it appends the clone to the body over here. And then once we have that template appended to the body, we just populate it with our data. And we just keep doing that over and over again in that way. So it's a really nice way to have a very small amount of code and easily fill up a large amount of data. All right, so the next use case that I'm going to show you, I call the detector pattern. It's also a frequent thing that we see done with extensions. So the scenario here is that we want to figure out if pages that the user is navigating to contain some piece of key data. So we'll do some matching against the pages that the user goes to. And then we just want to do a simple indicator saying that yes, that or no, that data does or does not exist. The way we can do this is with a content script. So we'll inject a content script into all the pages that the user navigates to, and then we'll do some examination on those pages. And once we determine that one of these pages has the content that we're looking for, we can send a message to a background page and say, put up a page action. So as a reminder, a page action was that small icon that appears in the Google Chrome Omnibox and can be toggled on and off. So let's look at an example that does this. I'm going to open up a new tab here. And I have this extension bookmarked. So this is a sandwich detecting extension. Very important, especially if you're hungry. So I'm going to install this. And what this extension will do is that when I navigate to a page that's talking about sandwiches, it's going to show me an icon like this that you see right here that indicates there's sandwiches being talked about on that page. So I'll start out by doing a Google search for, let's say, puppies. And you can see nothing is appearing in my Chrome Omnibox here. which is a good sign. It means people aren't making puppy sandwiches. If I search for roast beef, on the other hand, there we go. We get our sandwich icon. So this page is talking about sandwiches. All right, let's see how this thing is implemented. So I'll start by looking at our manifest file here. We're going to see another new thing in here, which is that we are specifying a content script here. And we give it a couple of match patterns. You can see that these are wildcards, indicating that our content script will be injected into every HTTP and every HTTPS page that the user navigates to. And then we're specifying a JS file here. We could also specify a CS file if we wanted to. It's not an either or. You can inject both and even inject multiple JavaScript and CSS files into any page. And we're specifying a file called contentscript.js. So I'm going to pull that up next. This is the file that's actually going to do our detection. You can see it's a very simple file. We have a regex here, which probably not surprisingly just says sandwich in there. And if the regex successfully detects that, that match, we run a little function here. And the function we run is to send a request. So content scripts don't have as much permission as other parts of other extension components have, and we do that for security reasons. So in order for us to actually display some UI, we have to send this information that the content script has gathered to another part of the extension. In this case, we're going to send it to a background page. So this function here, which is in that utility Chrome.extension API, it's called send request. It's just going to broadcast a message. And then other components within our extension can listen for that message if they want. So next, I'll open up our background page. And here's, in this particular extension, here's the component that's doing the listening. So we're going to install a listener here, again, by using that Chrome.extension API. And you can see we have a callback function called onRequest, which will be triggered when the event happens. And here's that function. So we just have a simple method call in here to the page action API. And it just says show in the current ID. Sorry, in the current tab. And that's all there is to that. All right, so next, I'm going to talk a little bit about HTML5 integration. So I've listed out some of the most useful features, or some of them in any case, of HTML5 that you might want to pull into your extensions. I won't go through them all because I think we're a little short on time. I want to leave a little time for questions. But we have obviously, and I should say, when I say HTML5, what I'm really referring to is HTML5, CSS3, and the new JavaScript API. So that collection of new open web technology. So we have some new HTML5 tags that are available. There are also some really nice new CSS properties, filters, and animations. And then there's some JavaScript APIs for doing things like persistence. We're going to look at an example of this, as well as doing notifications. There's a whole lot more of these. I just wanted to give some examples. And when it comes to using these things in your extensions, since, like I said, extensions are web pages, you can just use this all seamlessly, just like you could in a regular web page. For a couple of these features, there are some little extra hooks into the extension system. So, for example, things like desktop notifications require a permission, and we give a hook into the extension system so that you don't have to explicitly ask the user for permission. You just do it one time at install. So let's look at an example of implementing some HTML5 features. I called this the pushier notifier pattern because I didn't really have a good name for it, but we looked at some notifiers already. The scenario here is that maybe we want to do some notifications with a little more information, something beyond just a few characters of text. A good example of this would be if you're doing some kind of news site, you want to show news alerts. And maybe we also want to let the user configure these notifications, so determine how frequently they can appear or in what way, what they look like, that sort of thing. And then finally, let's persist these notifications, these settings rather. So in order to do this, we're going to use desktop notifications. Like I said, any web page can use desktop notifications. There's a special hook for extensions to use them, though. And we're going to add an options page. We already saw an options page before, but we're going to look at how this one is implemented. That lets the user do some configuration on these settings. And finally, we're going to use web storage, specifically local storage, to save these settings so that they run across browser sessions. So even after the user closes their browser, the next time they fire it up, we'll still remember these settings. So for this particular example, it's not in the gallery like the other ones I've been showing you because it won't work for all users yet. So I'm going to load it as an unpacked extension. And you'll see when immediately when I load it, it pops up this, this desktop notification here. It doesn't say a whole lot, it's just a demo. And we also have an options page attached to this, which I'll open up here. It just lets us set a couple of things about this. So we can set how frequently the notification will appear. By default, this thing is going to appear every minute. And we can toggle it on or off here. So I'm going to reload this extension a couple times so it shows more notifications. You can see what it looks like in that case. And I don't want to wait a couple minutes to do that. So I'm just going to reload here and show a couple more notifications. You can see those here. These notifications will stack up. I believe up to 5 of them will show, and then they'll queue up behind the scenes, and as you close them, a new one will appear. So I'm going to go back to this options page and disable this thing because I don't want it to keep showing up while I'm showing you code. And I'll also close a couple of these here. All right, so let's see how this thing is implemented. So first, we'll start with our manifest file again. And again, looks pretty similar to our other manifest files. One thing that we've added here is this notifications permission. So if you've seen notifications in the wild before, you've probably noticed that when you go to a web page that wants to show you a notification, you get an info bar that says, hey, is it OK for this web page to show you notifications? But you didn't see that with this extension. And the reason is because of this notifications permission. I mentioned this briefly earlier. This is not yet available in the stable channel of Google Chrome, but it's available everywhere else, and it will be available in the next stable version. All right, so once we have that notifications permission, we can just go ahead and show notifications. So I'm going to open up this background page, which does the notifying. And you can see here we have an if statement that tests to see whether the notification is active. That's a setting that we'll look at in a second. And if it is active, it calls this show function. Let's look at that function now. Here it is. So you can see these notifications. If I zoom in again, they display a little time. And we just calculate the current time here. And then we create a notification. We do this with a method called webkit-notifications.createNotification. And we just supply a couple of properties. This notification happens to be a standard notification. You can also do HTML notifications. So we could, instead of just supplying text like this, we could actually supply an HTML file and completely take over the rendering ourselves. And then once we've created our notification object, all we do is call show on it, and that'll display it. And the one more thing that I want to look at here is this options page that I showed. So you'll see this is a very simple HTML file here. And like we saw, there are just a couple of form inputs in here. We have one, a checkbox for determining whether or not the notification is active, and then we have another for setting how frequently those notifications will appear. We just attach event handlers to each of these options. And you'll see that when this thing is triggered, what we do is we save the value into a local storage object. So local storage is another HTML5-like API. By default, every page will have a local storage object available to it. And you just treat it like a regular object. So we're setting a property called isActivated on the local storage object and giving it a value. Down here, you'll see we're setting a property called frequency and giving it the value of that input field. Then if I go back to our background page here, we can just seamlessly use these values as if they were declared in this page. So if I want to test the value of the isActivated field, I just say local storage is activated. If I want to look at frequency, I just say local storage.frequency. Couldn't really be simpler. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here by talking about our experimental APIs. Let me close this notification. So we currently have 5 experimental APIs. I'll just list them out here quickly. So our philosophy with respect to APIs is that we want our APIs to be very stable once they're fully available. But we also want the ability to play with stuff and have users give us feedback and suggestions. And we do that by creating these experimental APIs. So we have stuff for doing info bars, context menus, managing the clipboard, as well as cookies and processes within the browser. So in order to use these experimental APIs, there's a couple of tricks that you need to do. The first is that you have to be using a dev channel build of Google Chrome. And then you have to start up the browser with this experimental flag. It's called Enable Experimental Extension APIs. Very difficult to say. And then finally, you'll just add an experimental permission to your manifest file, and that lets you plug into these experimental APIs. So let's look at an example of that. Again, since this is not fully available, I'm going to be loading an Unpack version of this. Actually, I should probably run through my little use case here. So the scenario that we're going to be talking about is that we want to take content from one page and import it into another app. Maybe we're viewing that content or editing it. And we can either put this into a new window or tab or just load it directly into that current window. The way we can do this, we can use the context menu. So we can make it so that the user right-clicks or the equivalent on some kind of resource on a page. We can grab that and pull it into our app using the context menu. And then we're going to use the Windows or Tabs API to make it so that we open a new window or reload the contents of the current window. So again, let me go back here and install this thing. So you guys probably saw during our keynote the amazing MugTug Darkroom app, which is a photo editing app. This is an extension that they are experimenting with in conjunction with that app. So it'll let me go to any page. I'm going to do that puppy search again. And let me look at images. So it's going to add a context menu item for when I right-click on an image. So if I happen to click somewhere else, you'll see there's nothing special in my context menu here. But if I click on one of these images, I now get this Edit in Darkroom option. And I can click on that, and it'll open that image in the Darkroom app. That seemed not to work, so let me try that again. Well, let's pretend that it works. It worked earlier, trust me. It is experimental, though. Let's see how that's implemented, though. So we're going to start with the manifest file again. And this is really simple to implement. So as I mentioned, for using an experimental API, all you do is add this experimental permission. And then this extension has a background page that will actually make the call to the context menu API, which is right here. It's calling this create function. And then we give it the title of the menu item, which resources to operate on, in this case, images, and then we have a callback function. So in that callback function, we're reloading the current tab. Again, we're using the tabs API. And it's loading up their URL and passing in as a parameter the image that was clicked on. So that's a quick example of what you can do with the experimental APIs. I should note that when you're building an extension that uses experimental APIs, you can't actually upload them to the gallery. That's why I downloaded a local copy. So these are more for tinkering with stuff, trying out future stuff, and especially giving us feedback. We love to hear feedback on these APIs. That's why we put them out so early. All right, so now I'm going to take some questions. I just want to show you a couple of resources that we have. So all the code that I showed, and I went through it pretty quickly, but if you want to examine it in more depth, it's all online. The Wave notifier you can get to by going to jump/wave-crx-src. And all the other extensions I showed you can get to by going to jump-crx-src. And finally, we have some additional resources that are really helpful as you get started writing extensions. If you're going to start anywhere, definitely go to the docs at code.google.com/chrome/extensions. These other resources, the discussion group and blog, are linked to from there. And again, here's our Wave back channel and our hashtag. So I have about 5 or so minutes for taking questions. And I'll also I'll take a live question first, and then I'll look in the moderator and see if there are any questions in there. So any questions out there? Yes?
Any gotchas to using standard JavaScript libraries like jQuery or other things in your plugins?
Yeah, great question. So one thing that I didn't talk about is that we have this concept in the extension system called isolated worlds, where we run content scripts in a separate execution environment than the JavaScript environment on the page. We do this for a couple of reasons. One is security. I talked about regular web pages being walled off from the extension system, so this helps us with that. But we also do it for compatibility. So for example, let's say that web page is running one version of jQuery, and your extension is running another version of jQuery. They're not compatible with each other. That could potentially cause a conflict. But because we have these isolated worlds, they don't interact with each other, and you never get that conflict. And also, any additional JavaScript libraries or frameworks, you can just add into your extension directory just like you would on a regular website. Yes?
So you talked about XHR and that there is a permission model. You have to declare which sites you want to go to. I know that once you inject a code inside the main page, it behaves a little differently than what's running as an extension, and it does not have direct access to go to the sites which you include in the permission list. Is that intentional, and is there a plan to change that?
So I think if I'm understanding you right, that's the issue I just talked about, which is this isolated world. So you're actually not in the JavaScript environment of the page. You're in a separate JavaScript environment.
That is correct. But even if it is running as a separate entity, it still does not have access to go to the sites which are listed in the permissions tab. You can only communicate with the extension. Is that correct? Or at least that was my experience.
So you're talking about doing XHR work from the content script?
That's right.
Yeah. So I very briefly mentioned that content scripts don't have all the access that other extension components have. In particular, they cannot do XHR. So what you have to do in that case is, from your content script, you send a message like I showed, and then your background page or whatever makes the XHR and sends it back and so forth. Before I take the next question, let me be a little meta here, and I'm going to open up my Wave notifier here and go to this Wave just to make sure, see if there's any queued up moderator questions in there. OK, while we're waiting for wave to flow, go ahead.
Do you have any suggestion for the automation test for the Chrome extension?
Automated testing?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I've seen some internal threads about that, and people have been trying some stuff out, but I haven't really seen a good solution that I could recommend at this point. But it's definitely a good question to ask, and I'd love to see you throw that up maybe on our discussion group. Probably other developers would maybe have some input on stuff that they've tried successfully or not. Yes? Oh, sorry, are there questions on this side?
Yes.
Go ahead, yes.
On your Google Wave notifier, you used authentication.
Yep.
Is there any reason why we can't use other OAuth authenticators, or do we have to stick to using the Google one?
Nope, that's just a library that we provide. You could definitely do it all on your own or use another library. This is just one.
Use another service provider.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah, with that library, you can use any service provider you want. We showed a TweetDeck demo that, for example, uses a similar library and authenticates against Twitter.
Okay.
Yep. Let me just take a moderator question in here. Are we able to call JavaScript? I think I answered this one with the isolated worlds one. We got that one. Are there any books you recommend for diving deeper into Chrome extensions? Well, extensions are pretty new. There's not books out there that I know of yet. Certainly, our documentation I would highly recommend. I think it's really comprehensive. That's another good question for the discussion group. I don't know, maybe someone's found a book out there. Yes, go ahead.
Is there any way to make the native extension NPAPI to communicate with any of those Chrome extension?
Yep, so the Google Chrome extension system supports NPAPI. So you can create NPAPI plugins. There's security issues with NPAPI because you're creating native code that will run on the user machine. So we definitely prefer it if you can do this in the extension system. But we understand that the extension system can't account for all use cases yet, and so we do support NPAPI.
But the question is more, is it possible to communicate or trigger any of the Chrome extension from NPAPI, like the background pages or?
Yes, yes. So
you can trigger the action pages or background pages from the NPAPI?
Yeah, so you can interact with your NPAPI plugin and the other components within your extension.
How is it exactly to be done? Is it a JavaScript call like that?
Yeah, you can do it through JavaScript. It's kind of a big topic, though, so talk to me offline, and I'll point you to some resources for doing that.
Right, thank you very
Sure.
much.
Any other questions? We have probably time for one more, so let me take some from moderator here. All right, how can an extension launch an executable on the user's machine? For example, launch Vim to edit a text area. So that's actually goes back to that NPAPI question. You can do that with an NPAPI plugin. I mentioned way back in the beginning of this talk that we automatically review and approve almost every extension that's uploaded to the gallery. The one exception is that, or not the one exception, one of the exceptions is that if you use an NPAPI plugin, we have to do a manual review on that because you're creating code that executes directly on the user's machine. So I'm going to answer this last question, and then we'll wrap up. Is there a set of UI guidelines that you would like extensions to follow? So I think we impose this UI restrictions a little bit with the extension APIs. So for example, you can only use one UI surface in your extension. For example, you can't have an extension that is both a browser action and a page action. So we kind of want these UI guidelines to just work. They're not UI guidelines that I know of, but I would not be surprised if someone out there wrote a best practices. Another good question for our discussion group. So with that, we are almost exactly out of time. I have 3 seconds left. Thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed this. And if you have any questions after, just let me know.